In the darkest years of the Great Depression, when paychecks vanished and dinner tables grew empty, American families had to get creative. Every meal was an act of survival, but also an act of love. Out of scarcity came ingenuity, and from the simplest ingredients came dishes that fed millions. Some of these foods were comforting, others were strange, and a few were barely edible at all. But each one tells a story about resilience, community, and the way Americans pulled together during hard times. Today, we're uncovering 20 forgotten Great Depression dishes that fed millions. From makeshift pies that fooled the taste buds, to soups that stretched scraps into feasts, to desserts made with no butter, eggs, or sugar. These recipes carried families through the hardest decade of the 20th century. Some may stir nostalgia, others may surprise you, and a few might make you wonder how anyone ever ate them. But together, they remind us of the strength, sacrifice, and creativity that shaped the America we remember. And it all begins with one of the most famous survival dishes of the era, a hodgepodge stew that carried the name of the president himself. Right, Arrow, this is the story of Hoover Stew. When you think of the Great Depression, one dish captures the desperation and the ingenuity of the era better than any other: Hoover Stew. Named, sometimes mockingly, after President Herbert Hoover, this stew was a staple in government-run soup kitchens across America. It wasn't a recipe passed down through cookbooks or carefully measured out in family kitchens. Instead, it was a dish born out of necessity, designed to stretch limited supplies into something that could fill as many bowls as possible. The ingredients were simple: elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs, and sometimes a handful of beans or vegetables if they were available. The result was a watery but filling stew that could feed dozens of hungry mouths with just a few cheap ingredients. It was served in ladles, often to long lines of unemployed men, women, and children who depended on these meals to survive. For many, Hoover Stew symbolized both failure and survival. Failure, because it reflected the widespread poverty of the era, a reminder that people were eating hot dogs and soup instead of meat roasts or hearty casseroles. But survival, too, because it kept bellies warm, gave children calories to grow, and reminded families that no matter how little they had, they still had something. For those who lived through it, Hoover Stew wasn't just food. It was a memory of neighbors helping neighbors, of volunteers ladling out bowls with a smile, and of families finding strength in the most difficult of times. It was a dish no one wanted, but everyone needed. Right, Arrow, and while Hoover Stew filled soup kitchen bowls, the next Depression-era dish came from family kitchens, where resourceful home cooks turned a pantry staple into one of the strangest pies America has ever known. Imagine sitting down to a slice of pie, expecting the sweet tang of lemon or the richness of custard, only to find out the main flavor came from vinegar. Strange as it sounds, this was once a beloved Depression-era dessert. During the 1930s, staples like fresh fruit, sugar, and butter were expensive luxuries that many families simply couldn't afford. But vinegar, cheap, shelf-stable, and already sitting in most pantries, became an unlikely hero in the kitchen. Cooks discovered that when vinegar was mixed with sugar, water, and a bit of flour, it mimicked the tart, citrusy flavor of lemon pie. Add a flaky crust, often made with lard instead of butter, and suddenly, a humble vinegar pie gave families a taste of sweetness in the middle of hardship. It wasn't fancy, but that was the point. Vinegar pie proved that comfort didn't require abundance. Just a little resourcefulness could transform scraps into something that felt special, even celebratory. For children growing up in the Depression, a slice of vinegar pie might have been their first real taste of dessert in weeks. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some remembered it as sharp and almost bitter, a poor imitation of real pies. But for others, it became a nostalgic reminder of survival, of mothers and grandmothers who could conjure sweetness out of nothing. In a way, vinegar pie wasn't just a recipe, it was a message of hope. That even in the toughest of times, there was still room for a little sweetness. Right, Arrow, and speaking of creating something from almost nothing, the next Depression dish took one of the cheapest ingredients of all, stale bread, and turned it into a hearty dessert that fed families night after night. In a time when nothing could be wasted, even stale bread found a second life on the American dinner table. Transformed into one of the most comforting desserts of the Great Depression, bread pudding. Families struggling through the 1930s knew that every crumb mattered. Doled, or even rock-hard loaves that might otherwise be thrown away became the foundation of a dish that was equal parts practical and heartwarming. Cubes of stale bread were soaked in a mixture of milk, sugar, and whatever else was on hand. Sometimes raisins, sometimes a sprinkle of cinnamon, often just the bare basics. Baked until golden, the humble pudding became a warm, filling treat that could stretch just a few ingredients into a dish big enough to feed the whole family. For children, bread pudding was often the highlight of the week, a sweet escape in a world where most meals were plain and repetitive. For parents, it was proof that they could still bring joy to their families, even in the hardest of times. And for many, the smell of bread pudding baking in the oven became forever tied to the feeling of safety and love. Of course, not every version was indulgent. Some were dry, bland, and served more as fuel than dessert. But even then, bread pudding carried a sense of dignity, a way to turn scraps into something that felt like tradition rather than desperation. It wasn't just dessert. It was a reminder that no matter how lean the years were, home could still be sweet. Right arrow, and while bread pudding turned leftovers into comfort, the next Depression dish showed how families managed to turn a garden vegetable into a surprisingly rich and filling meal. Today, we think of dandelions as pesky weeds in the yard, but during the Great Depression, they were a life-saving meal. When grocery budgets dried up, families turned to the land around them for sustenance. Fields, roadsides, and backyards became food sources, and one of the most common wild crops was the dandelion. Its leaves, when picked young, were tender, slightly bitter, and surprisingly nutritious. For families who couldn't afford fresh vegetables, dandelion greens became an essential source of vitamins and minerals. Mothers would gather the greens by hand, wash them carefully, and toss them with a bit of vinegar, salt, or lard drippings if they had any on hand. Some communities even cooked them down like spinach or collard greens, stretching them into soups or stews. For many children, dandelion green salad was the only fresh produce they tasted for weeks at a time. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Kids often wrinkled their noses at the sharp, bitter taste, longing instead for apples, oranges, or lettuce, luxuries far out of reach. But in hindsight, those simple bowls of dandelion greens were more than food. They represented resilience. They proved that even when money was gone, nature still provided. Dandelion greens reminded Depression-era families of something powerful, that survival wasn't just about what you could buy, but about what you could find and what you could make of it. Right arrow, and while families foraged in fields for greens, others found sweetness in an unexpected place, turning garden vegetables into pies that fooled the senses. What if I told you that some of the apple pies served during the Great Depression contained no apples at all? That was the reality of mock apple pie, one of the era's most inventive and surprising desserts. Apples were expensive, seasonal, and often impossible to find during the 1930s. But families craving the taste of America's most iconic dessert refused to give it up. So they improvised. The secret ingredient? Crackers. Cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to find, crackers became the unlikely base of this fake pie. When boiled with sugar, cinnamon, lemon rind, and a splash of vinegar, the crackers softened and absorbed the flavors, mimicking the texture and taste of baked apples. Layered inside a crust and baked, the result was shockingly convincing. Many children grew up swearing they were eating apple pie, only to discover years later it was nothing but crackers and spice. Mock apple pie became so popular that even brands like Ritz Crackers began printing the recipe on their boxes, marketing it as a thrifty alternative during lean years. It wasn't just a dessert. It was a symbol of American creativity, proof that with a little ingenuity, families could hold on to tradition even when the ingredients weren't there. For many, mock apple pie was bittersweet, a reminder of hardship disguised as comfort. It tasted like the American dream, but behind every slice was the reality of survival. Right arrow, and while mock apple pie fooled the taste buds, the next dish didn't try to hide its simplicity at all. It embraced it with nothing more than beans, ketchup, and a slice of bread. It may sound simple, even too simple, but in the 1930s, beans on toast was more than just a quick meal. It was survival on a plate. Canned beans were cheap, filling, and widely available even during the toughest years of the Depression. Combined with bread, which could be stretched from homemade loaves or purchased for just a few cents, families created a dish that offered protein, fiber, and enough calories to keep hunger at bay. Some served the beans straight from the can, others added ketchup or molasses to sweeten the flavor, and a lucky few had onions or bacon grease to give it extra richness. What made beans on toast so important wasn't the taste, but the accessibility. Almost anyone, from city tenements to rural farmhouses, could make it. Children ate it before school, workers ate it after long days of job hunting, and families gathered around it when there wasn't much else to share. For many who grew up in that era, the memory of beans on toast is bittersweet. Some recall it with warmth, a comfort food that filled their bellies. Others remember it as a symbol of scarcity, a reminder that they couldn't afford much else. Either way, it became one of the defining meals of the Depression. Beans on toast proved a powerful truth. Even the humblest ingredients, when paired together, could carry a family through hard times. Right-arrow, but beans weren't the only pantry staple that carried families through the Depression. The next dish turned leftover potatoes into a golden, crispy meal that stretched a few spuds into something that felt like a feast. In the Great Depression, a single potato could go a long way, and when grated, fried, and seasoned, it became one of the most beloved thrifty meals of the era: potato pancakes. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and available in almost every corner of America. For immigrant families, particularly those with Eastern European roots, potato pancakes weren't just a way to stretch food. They were a taste of tradition. Grated potatoes mixed with flour, eggs, if available, and maybe an onion for flavor, were fried in whatever fat a family could spare. Crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, they turned scraps into something hearty and satisfying. For children, potato pancakes were a treat, eaten hot from the pan and often sprinkled with a pinch of salt or dipped in applesauce when times allowed. For adults, they were practical, easy to make, adaptable to whatever was in the pantry, and filling enough to keep hunger at bay until the next meal. In neighborhoods hit hard by unemployment, the smell of potatoes frying was a familiar comfort, drifting from one home to the next. But potato pancakes also carried a deeper meaning. They reminded families that even in poverty, food could connect them to their heritage, their culture, and their past. A simple plate of fried potatoes wasn't just sustenance. It was memory, identity, and resilience all at once. From farmhouses to city kitchens, potato pancakes proved that even in the leanest times, tradition could still be tasted at the table. Right-arrow, and while potatoes made for a crispy comfort, the next Depression dish looked to the cheapest grain of all, oats, and turned into breakfast, dinner, and sometimes even dessert. During the Great Depression, oats weren't just for breakfast. They became a foundation for nearly every meal of the day. Cheap, filling, and sold in bulk, oats were a lifeline for families trying to stretch their budgets. A bowl of hot oatmeal in the morning provided warmth and energy, but thrifty cooks didn't stop there. Oats found their way into meatloaf as a filler, into breads as a cheap extender, and even into cookies and cakes when flour or sugar were scarce. Some families even ate plain oats boiled with water for dinner, topped with nothing but a drizzle of molasses or a pat of lard if they were lucky. Children often grew weary of the endless bowls of oats, but parents valued them for one simple reason: they kept people alive. Oats provided bulk, kept hunger pangs away, and could be flavored in countless ways, depending on what scraps or seasonings were available. For many, oats weren't just food, they were survival disguised as routine. And yet, for all their plainness, oats carried a quiet comfort. The smell of porridge simmering on the stove in the morning meant there was at least something to eat that day. In a decade when so many went without, that small certainty mattered more than anything. Oats became the unsung hero of the Depression. Humble, unexciting, but dependable, carrying millions of families through their darkest years. Right-arrow, but while oats stretched across breakfast tables, the next depression dish came from gardens and fields, where even the simplest vegetable could be transformed into a sweet, comforting dessert. In the Great Depression, when sugar was scarce and expensive, Americans turned to an unlikely substitute: carrots. Carrots were cheap, easy to grow in backyard gardens, and naturally sweet. Resourceful home bakers discovered that grated carrots could add moisture, flavor, and a subtle sweetness to baked goods, leading to one of the era's most unusual treats: carrot cookies. These cookies weren't the sugar-packed desserts we know today. Instead, they were small, humble rounds made with flour, oats, a bit of fat, if available, and shredded carrots folded in. Sometimes raisins or a dash of cinnamon were added, but most versions were simple, a treat that stretched ingredients as far as possible. For children, carrot cookies were often a rare moment of joy, a taste of sweetness in a world where candy and cakes had all but disappeared. For parents, they were a victory, proof that even in hard times, they could still place a dessert on the table, still give their family something to smile about. Of course, not everyone loved them. Some kids groaned at the idea of vegetables in their cookies, and many remembered them as bland compared to pre-depression sweets. But for countless families, carrot cookies weren't about luxury. They were about love, resourcefulness, and finding sweetness where you least expected it. They reminded Depression-era families that sometimes the smallest joys, even in the form of a humble cookie, could make the hardest days feel just a little bit brighter. Right-arrow, and while carrots brought sweetness to cookies, the next depression dish came from something even plainer: a bowl of milk, stretched thin with bread to become a makeshift meal. It may sound like the simplest of meals, just bread and milk, but for many families during the Great Depression, milk toast was a source of comfort in the midst of struggle. The dish was exactly what it sounds like: slices of bread, often stale, soaked in warm milk, and sometimes sprinkled with sugar, cinnamon, or a pat of butter if those luxuries were on hand. It was soft, filling, and easy to digest, making it especially popular for children, the elderly, or anyone recovering from illness. But beyond its practicality, milk toast carried a kind of emotional weight. In a world where meat, vegetables, and sweets were often out of reach, a steaming bowl of milk toast felt nurturing. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, it was soothing, and it reminded people of home. Some families even passed it down as a tradition long after the Depression ended, serving it as a kind of nostalgic comfort food on cold mornings. Of course, others remembered it less fondly. For many, milk toast became a symbol of deprivation, a bland, watery meal that reminded them of how little they had. But whether cherished or disliked, it was unforgettable precisely because it carried the memory of those lean years. Milk toast wasn't just food, it was a memory in a bowl, one that captured both the hardship and the quiet resilience of Depression-era families. Right-arrow, and while milk toast offered warmth and comfort, the next Depression dish leaned on thrift and preservation, turning leftover scraps into one of the most enduring condiments in American history. When fresh food was scarce and refrigerators were a luxury, one of the oldest traditions in America kept families fed: pickling. During the Great Depression, pickled vegetables became a kitchen staple. Families couldn't afford to waste a single cucumber, carrot, or beet pulled from their gardens. Instead, they preserved them in vinegar and salt, creating jars of tangy, long-lasting food that could brighten meals through the leanest months. Pickling wasn't just a way to save food, it was a survival strategy. Mothers and grandmothers filled cellars with jars, lining shelves with glistening preserves that would last through winter. A jar of pickled beans or cucumbers could stretch a meager dinner of bread and lard into something that felt more satisfying. Children often remembered the sharp, briny bite as one of the few bursts of flavor in otherwise plain meals. Beyond the taste, pickling represented something bigger: security. At a time when jobs were scarce and money unpredictable, a stocked pantry gave families peace of mind. Even if the paycheck stopped, the shelves of jars promised that no one would go hungry. Of course, not every jar was a delight. Some turned too sour, some spoiled, and some are little more than boiled weeds saved in desperation. But to families of the Depression, each jar told a story of resourcefulness, of making sure nothing went to waste. Pickled vegetables were more than just food. They were hope in a jar, a reminder that even in the harshest times, families could preserve a little comfort for tomorrow. Right arrow, and while pickling helped preserve vegetables, the next Depression dish leaned on the cheapest staple of all, turning plain rice into endless variations of thrifty, filling meals. In the Great Depression, one grain became a quiet hero in countless kitchens: rice. Cheap, versatile, and filling, rice was the backbone of many Depression-era meals. Families stretched a single pot of rice into endless variations, from savory dinners to sweet desserts. Sometimes it was boiled with beans for protein, sometimes fried with scraps of vegetables, and sometimes simmered with milk and sugar to become rice pudding, a rare treat in hard times. Rice was especially important in immigrant communities, where traditions from Asia, the South, and Latin America met Depression-era frugality. For some, rice and beans became a daily staple. For others, rice pudding was a comfort that carried the taste of home. Even those who had never eaten much rice before the Depression came to rely on it as one of the cheapest ways to keep families full. Of course, rice dishes weren't always glamorous. Many meals were nothing more than plain white rice with salt or lard. But for parents, the sight of a full pot meant security. No one would go to bed hungry that night. For children, it was a memory of bowls that seemed endless, of meals that repeated day after day, and of the quiet strength that came with making do. Rice reminded Depression-era families that survival didn't always come from abundance. Sometimes, it came from learning how to make the most of one humble grain. Right arrow, and while rice was a versatile staple, the next Depression dish came from the humblest of beginnings: a soup made from scraps, bones, and anything else families could find to stretch into a meal. In the Great Depression, nothing was wasted, not even the bones. Bone soup, sometimes called poor man's broth, was one of the most common meals in the 1930s. Families who couldn't afford cuts of meat would often buy leftover bones from the butcher for just pennies, or sometimes get them for free. Those bones, often stripped of nearly all meat, were simmered for hours in water, drawing out every last bit of flavor and nutrition. The resulting broth became the base for soups and stews, bulked up with potatoes, carrots, onions, or even noodles if they were available. Sometimes it was thin, little more than flavored water. Other times, it was hearty enough to feed a family for days. Either way, bone soup stretched scraps into sustenance, turning what many would throw away into something life-saving. For children, bone soup was often remembered as endless bowls of broth, served night after night. For parents, it was a lifeline, one of the few ways to provide something warm and filling when cupboards were bare. And for communities, it was a shared dish, often served in church kitchens or by neighbors pooling together what little they had. Bone soup was more than a meal. It was a lesson in resilience, a reminder that in hard times, even the scraps could sustain a family. Right arrow, and while bone soup stretched meat scraps, the next Depression dish took the cheapest vegetable of all, onions, and turned them into a surprisingly hearty meal. During the Great Depression, one of the cheapest vegetables in the market became the star of the dinner table: the onion. Onions were inexpensive, easy to store, and widely available, which made them a go-to ingredient when there wasn't much else to cook. Families would slice them thin, sauté them in a bit of fat or lard if they had it, then simmer them in water to create a simple, filling onion soup. It wasn't the rich, cheesy version you'd find in French restaurants. This was the poor man's version, bare bones and practical. For many households, the sharp bite of onions softened by long cooking was a comforting flavor, especially when paired with a hunk of stale bread soaked in the broth. Onions also provided something important: variety. When most meals were based on beans, bread, or potatoes, the strong flavor of onion soup felt like a break from monotony. Some families even grew their own onions in backyard gardens, ensuring a steady supply of one of the few vegetables they could depend on year-round. For children, onion soup wasn't always a favorite, but it meant full stomachs and warmth on cold nights. For parents, it was one of the few meals they could stretch with pride, a hot pot that fed everyone, even if it was simple. Onion soup stood as proof that sometimes even the humblest ingredient could carry a family through the hardest days. Right arrow, and while onions brought sharp flavor to the table, the next depression dish took sweetness from an equally humble crop, the peanut, and turned it into a filling meal that stretched across America. In the Great Depression, when meat was too expensive and sweets were hard to come by, one humble spread stepped in to save the day: peanut butter. By the 1930s, peanut butter had already become popular in American kitchens, thanks to its long shelf life and low cost. Packed with protein and calories, it was an affordable substitute for meat, and it quickly became a staple in households struggling to feed their families. But beyond sandwiches, peanut butter made its way into dozens of Depression-era delights. Mothers mixed it with sugar and oats to form no-bake cookies. Some stirred it into soups for extra richness, while others spread it on crackers for a quick snack. And in homes lucky enough to afford a little cocoa or honey, peanut butter balls became a rare and treasured treat. For children, peanut butter was often the highlight of the day, a creamy, nutty flavor that stood out in an otherwise bland diet of beans and bread. For parents, it was a lifesaver, providing both nutrition and versatility. And for many, it became forever tied to the memory of resilience, the jar in the pantry that never seemed to run out. Of course, not every family loved it. Some remembered eating so much peanut butter that they swore it off for life. But even then, it symbolized something important: survival. Peanut butter wasn't just a spread during the Depression. It was a symbol of thrift, creativity, and the small joys that helped families endure. Right arrow, and while peanut butter offered comfort from a jar, the next Depression dish came bubbling from the oven, a casserole that turned scraps and leftovers into something that felt like a real family dinner. In the kitchens of the Great Depression, one vegetable found its way into endless meals: cabbage. Cabbage was cheap, easy to grow, and hearty enough to last for weeks without spoiling. Families leaned on it for soups, stews, and salads. But one of the most common ways it appeared on the dinner table was in the form of a simple casserole, layered with rice, potatoes, or scraps of meat when available. Cabbage casserole was a dish that stretched a few ingredients into something that felt filling and complete. In immigrant households, especially those with Eastern European roots, versions of stuffed cabbage were adapted into casserole form. Instead of rolling each leaf, cooks chopped the cabbage and baked it with whatever they had: tomato sauce if they could spare it, breadcrumbs if they were lucky, or just a bit of salt and fat to carry the flavor. For children, it was often a love-it-or-hate-it dish. Some found the taste comforting, while others dreaded the strong smell that filled the house as it cooked. For parents, however, cabbage casserole represented practicality. It was inexpensive, nutritious, and could be made in large batches to feed big families or stretch across multiple days. Cabbage casserole may not have been glamorous, but symbolized the heart of Depression cooking: simple, thrifty, and designed to keep everyone fed. Right arrow, and while cabbage casserole brought families together at the dinner table, the next Depression dish often showed up in lunch pails, a sweet, sticky treat that gave children a taste of joy in the middle of hard times. When sugar was too expensive, families turned to something darker, stickier, and far more affordable: molasses. During the Great Depression, molasses was a pantry staple. It was cheaper than refined sugar, widely available, and packed with calories, something desperately needed when food was scarce. Families spread it on bread to create what became known as the molasses sandwich. Sometimes butter was added if it was on hand, but more often it was just a slice of bread folded over with a thick smear of molasses inside. Molasses sandwiches became especially popular for children's lunches. They were sweet, easy to make, and provided enough energy to keep kids going through long school days. For many families, it was the only dessert children would get in an entire week. What made the molasses sandwich unique was its connection to America's earlier history. Molasses had been a staple since colonial times, but in the Depression, it took on new meaning. It became the poor man's sweet, a substitute for candy, cake, and cookies that were no longer affordable luxuries. Of course, Not every child loved them. The sticky texture and strong, bittersweet flavor could be overwhelming. Yet for others, it was a treasured memory, a moment of sweetness in an otherwise lean and difficult childhood. Molasses sandwiches weren't just food. They were resilience, proof that even in the hardest times, people found a way to make life a little sweeter. Right arrow, and while molasses provided sweetness, the next dish we'll look at was all about survival, a stew that made scraps and leftovers feel like a feast. If the Great Depression had a signature dish, it might just be Mulligan stew, the hobo's feast of scraps and survival. Mulligan stew wasn't made from a recipe. It was made from whatever you had. In hobo camps across America, men traveling the railroads would gather together around a pot. One might contribute a potato, another a carrot, someone else a scrap of meat, and another just a pinch of salt. What resulted was a communal stew that stretched meager rations into something filling. The name Mulligan itself became slang for a makeshift, thrown-together version of something. And during the Depression, that's exactly what this dish was, a symbol of cooperation in desperate times. For men who had lost everything, sitting around a campfire with others and sharing what little they had gave a sense of belonging, a reminder of community in the loneliest of years. For children who heard stories about Mulligan stew, it became part of the folklore of the Depression era. Some families even recreated it at home, throwing together leftover vegetables, bits of bread, and small amounts of meat into a single pot. The stew might not have always tasted great, but it filled empty stomachs and gave people hope. In its own way, it represented the idea that survival wasn't just about food, it was about people looking out for one another. Mulligan stew wasn't really about the ingredients. It was about the people who shared it, and the reminder that even in poverty, generosity still mattered. Right arrow, but while Mulligan stew was a dish of community, the next Depression staple was a humble slice of comfort, born from the simplest of ingredients, bread and gravy. Sometimes the most comforting meals are also the simplest, just bread covered in gravy. During the Great Depression, meat was a luxury that many families could rarely afford. But what they often did have was flour, fat, and water, enough to make a thin gravy. Poured over day-old bread, it became a meal in itself, bread and gravy. This dish might sound plain today, but for millions of families, it was a lifesaver. The gravy gave bread a richness and warmth that helped stretch meager supplies into something hearty. Children often looked forward to it, because it made the difference between eating something filling or go to bed hungry. In many households, Sunday dinner meant a roast, but only on rare occasions. The rest of the week, the leftover drippings from that one roast might be stretched into gravy after gravy, poured over bread, biscuits, or potatoes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. For parents, serving bread and gravy carried a bittersweet feeling. It was nourishing, but it was also a reminder of what they didn't have. Still, in hard times, this simple dish provided both calories and comfort. It turned the plainest food in the pantry into something that felt like a real meal. Bread and gravy may not have been much, but for families scraping by, it was proof that even the humblest ingredients could bring warmth to the dinner table. Right arrow, and while bread and gravy gave comfort at home, the next Depression dish was often carried in lunchboxes to work or school. An unusual pie made without fruit at all. Imagine biting into a warm slice of pie, only to find out there were no apples inside at all. During the Great Depression, apples were expensive and often hard to come by. But pie was a staple of American life, a comfort food that families didn't want to give up. The solution? Mock apple pie, a clever dessert made not from fruit, but from crackers. Recipes called for breaking up soda crackers and layering them in a pie crust, then covering them with sugar, cinnamon, lemon juice, and a bit of water. Once baked, the crackers softened and absorbed the flavors, mimicking the texture and taste of real apples. It was so convincing that many children never realized they weren't eating fruit. The dish became so popular that Nabisco even printed the recipe for mock apple pie on Ritz cracker boxes for decades. For families living through hard times, it was a way to preserve tradition, the feeling of sitting down with a slice of pie, without the high cost of fruit. But there's an emotional twist here, too. While families enjoyed the ingenuity, the dish was also a reminder of scarcity. It was pie without apples, sweetness without luxury, joy created from necessity. Mock apple pie may have fooled the taste buds, but more importantly, it kept a piece of American comfort alive when times were hardest. Right-ero, and as creative as that was, the next Depression dish didn't even try to imitate luxury. It was pure survival food, a pot of beans that could feed a family for days. Looking back at these humble recipes, it's easy to see why they've been forgotten. Cabbage casseroles, molasses sandwiches, and mock apple pies don't exactly appear on modern menus. Yet each of these dishes tells a story, not just about food, but about resilience, creativity, and the will to keep going when times were unimaginably hard. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a test of everyday survival. Families learned how to stretch every crumb, turn scraps into meals, and make do with what they had. For children of that era, these dishes are more than recipes. They are memories of parents who sacrificed, neighbors who shared, and communities that found hope in the simplest comforts. Today, many of these meals seem outdated, even strange. But they also carry lessons worth remembering. They remind us that food is never just about taste. It's about history, family, and survival. In tough times, these dishes fed millions. And in remembering them, we honor the spirit of a generation that endured the unimaginable. So the next time you bite into a slice of pie, or stir a pot of stew, think of those who once did the same with far less. Their meals may have been plain, but their perseverance was extraordinary. Backhand index pointing right. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten foods of the Great Depression, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe for more stories of the America we remember.